Alright, welcome back, and today what we're going to talk about is, or what I'm going to talk about, is social movements. This is lecture 49, and what exactly do I mean by social movements? Well, we're going to, as we know, we have already talked about one major social movement. We're not going to reinvent the wheel here, but a big social movement that was going on during this time, the post-war years. So we're talking about the 1950s, 1960s, maybe early 1970s, kind of seeping in there. Well, the big social movement that we talked about during this time was the Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Movement was affecting a tremendous amount of change. It was a very successful movement, as movements go, during this particular time period. And as you can tell from other lectures that we've talked about covering this particular time period, there's a lot of changes and there's a lot of challenges taking place, and there's also a lot of potential. You know, we're talking about a relatively more stable and wealthier time period. So there's a lot more resources to put into, generating these social movements. So what we have going on is we have a whole bunch of different people who are looking around and saying, well, wait a minute, the Civil Rights Movement has become very, very successful. But I happen to have come from a particular group that is also oppressed, or I represent a particular point of view that is oftentimes put down, and I'd like to be able to get my point across and say what I have to say. So why don't we organize our own particular groups and use very similar methods to get our points across. Protests and sit-ins and civil disobedience and even some militantism. Militantism? Anyway. So there were a lot of other groups that kind of started to model themselves after the civil rights groups, and going all the way from peaceful resistance to Black Power movement. We're going to see a lot of parallels here. So what I want to do today is I want to talk a little bit about social movements in general. And then I want to talk about a few of the social movements that were coming out of this particular time period. And this is where I'm going to give a little caveat before we actually get started. Look, the reality is that these social movements that are coming out of the 1960s, 1970s, many of them are still around. Many of these issues have not been totally resolved yet, and there are people who are involved in these social movements, and they're very, very passionate about their beliefs and what they feel. I've been a participant in many of these social movements myself, and continue to be to a certain extent now. So such people are oftentimes very, very passionate, and you got to understand. I'm trying to keep these videos down to in and around 30 to 40 minutes. So I'm going to treat each one of these social movements relatively rapidly. So I know I'm going to leave stuff out, and there are going to be folks out there watching these videos who represent these social movements, and they're going, oh, well, he didn't mention it's not my intention to leave anybody out. I'm going to kind of hit upon what I see as the highlights of these groups, and I'm going to move on. So please feel free, if you are a participant in these social movements, as I have been in many cases, take a look down there. There's all these options to comment, and please enlighten us on the things that I've missed. I know that we'll get a lot out of that. And if you want to argue, please go ahead too. And just keep it civil and don't be stupid. Which is kind of a pretty good mantra to follow, I think. So anyway, let's move on here. All right, there we go. So what we're going to do is we're going to analyze the influences on and contributions of the new social movements rising during the post-war era. Let's come on, move. All right, so here we are. First of all, what do I mean by a social movement? Social movements are movements that are specifically organized around the idea of changing something within the society, creating some kind of a social change. So consequently, these social movements tend to be relatively liberally oriented. So when we take a look at social movements, we can really think about two different kinds of social movements. One is a reform movement. A reform movement is a movement that intends to change something about the existing social institutions. So if we want to, if there's something that's going on in government that we don't like, we want to change it. We don't necessarily want to knock down the government. We just want to change that thing in government that we think is not working very well. On the other hand, you have radical movements, and these radical social movements do intend. Their goal, of course, is to eliminate whatever it is that's problematic in society, or to eliminate or change the institution. So if the government isn't working, then what we need to do is get rid of the government and put up a new government, or maybe not a government, depending on the focus here. So these are radicals, all right? So if we look at this on the spectrum here, I'll have to stay there. We're mostly going to talk about reform movements. We're not going to leave out the radical movements. And these reform movements, again, tend to be liberal in that they are pursuing some kind of a social change to pursue and increase, to make people more free or more equal, or to increase social justice. That is the goal. We can argue as to whether or not they actually do that, but that is at least the goal. Their manifest goals here. Now, every movement is going to face a counter movement, an attempt to stop or to restrict or to reverse social changes, and this is what we would refer to as a counter movement. So counter movements are there to try to change or to stop the changes that social movements are trying to put into place, or if a social movement has been successful in changing something within society, the counter movement wants to change it back to the traditional ways of doing things. Consequently, counter movements tend to be a little bit more conservative. So we can kind of see the idea, for instance, of a Tea Party movement that intends to go back to, or to try to get us back to traditional ways of running our government and running our society in the face of liberal changes that have come about that have ruined our society as far as the Tea Party is concerned. So now a couple of the goals or a couple of the focuses of these social movements is where we might have political social movements. These are political and economic social movements. These are social movements that are designed to try to change some kind of a policy. Right, and it could be an economic policy or political policy, government policy, whatever. So these are political social movements. We also have cultural social movements, and cultural social movements are designed to try to change something that is intrinsic to our culture. So we're going to talk about all of these things. They're not necessarily trying to, the cultural social movements are not necessarily trying to change policy, but rather to try to change mindsets. And oftentimes what we're going to see in any of these social movements is some combination of both happening there. Now, what we take a look at is we look at what I'll call a Histah process of reform. How do social movements end up coming about? Of course, the first thing that usually ends up happening is we end up with a historical understanding of the circumstances in which we live. So we can take a look at the Civil Rights Movement as an example of this, in that the historical circumstances under which people were living at that time was a result of slavery, culminating in Jim Crow and segregation. So we find ourselves living under circumstances that are totally historically constructed. They are not the natural way of being. So we communicate that. We communicate our dissatisfaction to other people, and they largely agree with us. Sometimes this communication ends up with an increased awareness of this situation. And comparative. So we have experience with societies that don't have segregation. We can look at historical contexts in which segregation did not exist. We can redefine the norms. Hey, if our society is founded on principles of equality, then why aren't black people equal to white people? So clearly we need to redefine some of the norms that we're looking at here. We can also question the legitimacy of norms that exist. So, for instance, folks who are advocating for same-sex marriage are kind of questioning the existence of norms that define marriage as being that takes place between a man and a woman. We oftentimes will have spokesmen, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, so these folks who became spokesmen, who became widely respected. They were folks that got people's attention. And ultimately, we end up with collective behavior, people coming together and acting. Not necessarily planned coming together and acting out toward achieving some particular kind of an end. But once these people come together, even if it's not planned, as collective behavior is not really necessarily planned, what they'll end up doing is organizing eventually and then planning the next event. Once you start planning the next event, bam, you've got yourself a social movement. Now, ultimately, what's going to happen is you plan the next event, and you plan the next event, and eventually you have you go through what's called institutionalization. You create organizations like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee or the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, right? So we see some of these things. So we're going to touch upon all of these little steps as we go along and talk about some of these movements. Now, so the first one I want to talk about is, and I get a lot of questions. I work in a high school with a large Hispanic, Latina population. So when I'm talking about civil rights, I almost always get hands going, "Hey, what about us?" Well, you were there. You were participating in this as well. So during this time period, we also see, as well as civil rights for African Americans, we also see groups that are dedicating themselves to civil rights for Latino and Latinas. We're going to talk here about a Mexican and Chicano movement. I know there's other Hispanic groups, right? And they all have their movements. There are Puerto Rican movements, and look, I only have a limited amount of time, so forgive me. But there's all kinds of great movements, all kinds of great organizations out there that are doing some really great work. But in this case, we're going to look at the Mexican and Chicano movement as it came to be known. So there were, for some reason, I've completely lost track of groups that were involved in this for some reason. Hold on, I'm going to pause. Okay, here we go. So, as I was trying to say, my brain glitched. But a couple of these groups that are going to be the initial, focus of the Mexican American movement is the League of United Latin American Citizens and the GI Forum, a group of Mexican former veterans from World War II coming out and saying, "Hey, we need to have better treatment than this." Look, much of the Mexican American experience is going to represent. At least the two groups that are going to be represented here in these movements are Mexican Americans, Mexicans who are citizens of the United States. Oftentimes, their families were living in regions that became the United States when the United States was Mexico. They became American citizens, and also immigrants, Mexican immigrants who are coming into the United States. So these groups are going to be represented here. Now, LULAC and the GI Forum are going to be focused on what they feel is the best way to do this is they're going to be focused on assimilation. Okay, Mexicans assimilating into American culture, learning English, investing in education, and gaining political power and political clout to speak for Mexican American citizens. And their background on this has to, especially is the abuses of the Bracero program that was put into place during World War II because of the labor shortages that happened as a result of the war. And large numbers of Mexican laborers were brought in and recruited, basically, to come into the United States and participate in the agricultural fields and picking crops and things along those lines. And this Bracero program was around right up into the early 1960s. And it was a fairly abusive system. And when you really stop and think about it, you were really pulling in and bringing in very low-wage labor and kind of exploiting these folks. So we really wanted to kind of back away from this particular system. But one thing that that LULAC and the GI Forum really not particularly focused on is illegal immigrants, or what we refer to as undocumented immigrants, or even immigrants, Mexican immigrants themselves. In fact, many of these groups decided that we might be a little bit better off if we restrict immigration coming in from Mexico. We really want to focus on citizen Mexicans. Well, this is going to change in the 1950s as a result of one of Eisenhower's operations called Operation Wetback, in which the immigration services went out and actually kind of just grabbed up and scooped up millions of Mexicans who were living in the United States, presumably illegally, although we didn't spend too much time bothering to check their legal status and shipping them across the border. which is kind of interesting because during this time we still had the Bracero program going on, and so you had one American government organization that was shipping Mexicans out of the country, and you had another government institution that was in Mexico shipping them back into the country. It kind of makes a bizarre kind of situation going on, but either way, many of these folks who were scooped up under this horribly named Operation Wetback many of them were citizens. Many of them were not illegals. Many of them were here legally. Families were split up, and it was a real mess. And there was a huge backlash against this, and that made a lot of these folks who were involved in the Mexican movement realize, hey, wait a minute, we can't separate out the needs of Mexican American citizens and the needs of Mexican immigrants. We're going to have to focus on the rights of all of these folks because they are, regardless of legal status, interconnected. We're also going to see the rise of what becomes known as a Chicano movement. This is a name that folks within this movement are actually going to embrace for themselves, to try to say, well, wait a minute, we don't necessarily want to assimilate entirely. We don't want to give up our culture. We don't want to give up our values. We want to be accepted as full-fledged citizens of the country without having to give all of that stuff up. And they're going to become a little bit more, maybe a little bit more radical, a little bit more militant in this, in preserving their culture, of course, investing tremendously in art, literature, and things along those lines. So we're talking about folks like David Sanchez here, or Rodolfo Gonzalez, and of course Cesar Chavez, the head of the United Farm Workers Union, to organize farm workers for better pay and better work conditions. These are folks who are very, very interested in preserving Mexican American culture. So we also see during this time what we call a Red Power movement, the Native American movement. Of course, now it's unfortunate. The last time we talked about Native Americans, we talked about them in terms of the New Deal, with John Collier, the head of the Interior Department under Franklin Roosevelt, making some reforms and kind of reestablishing the primacy of Native American culture and helping to reorganize the reservations in a way that's a little bit more fair, more egalitarian. We're going to change all that up. In the 1950s, we're going to see a turn against those particular New Deal policies. Look, landowners still want to get out there and get their hands on some of those reservation lands. So they create a policy that's called termination. And the idea behind this concept of termination is that these tribal lands, these reservation lands, exist at the whim of the Congress, and Congress can change those. So, for instance, House Concurrent Resolution 108 is going to be passed in the 1950s. That's actually going to give Congress the right to say, hey, your tribal lands, your reservation, is no longer recognized as a legal entity in the United States. Sorry, you're done. So bada boom, bada bing, we're out. And this is, of course, the native tribes are actually going to fight this in something called U.S. versus Wheeler, and they're actually going to win, where the Supreme Court's going to say, well, you just can't say that these tribes no longer exist. There's treaties, there's legal documents that show that they do exist, so you can't do that. We're also going to see, during this time, though, unfortunately, a lot of these tribes are going to be shut down. Their tribal lands are going to stop existing, and land is going to be confiscated, in essence. Many of these Native Americans are going to have to move into the cities, move away from the reservations, and try to assimilate into culture. Now, there were some programs to help them do that, but this is a huge shock against Native American culture. Many of them rebelled against this, and they start to develop for the first time in history what is referred to as ethnic identity, or ethnic Indians. These ethnic Indians are going to identify themselves not necessarily with particular Native American tribes, but seeing themselves as a people as a whole, as ethnic Indians or ethnic Native Americans. We're also going to see the rise of something called the American Indian Movement, or AIM. And AIM is going to be a little bit more of a militant, or a little bit more of a radical. These are folks who are actually going to say, hey, we have these existing treaties that are largely being ignored. Maybe what we need to do is really start to make a stink and cause some problems, and get these treaties to be to actually be recognized and understood. followed. Which would be kind of nice. The American Indian movement was also very active in preserving Native American culture, trying to bring back Native American languages and Native American religions and things along those lines. So some of the things, at one point, Native Americans are actually the prison at Alcatraz is going to be shut down, and because of a treaty that said that any federal lands that are held that are not being used, that were one-time Indian lands, can be reclaimed by Native Americans. So, that was Alcatraz Island. So Native Americans took over Alcatraz Island and said, hey, let's turn this into a community center. Let's turn this into a Native American place of gathering. And, of course, the federal government went, well, you know what, we're not using it. Sure, go ahead. Might as well do something good with it. No, I'm just kidding. They said, no, you got to get out of there. We're not using it, but you can't use it either. So they ended up surrounding the place, and ultimately the American Indians occupying Alcatraz had to leave. They also took over something called the Trail of Broken Treaties, which culminated in a march on Washington, D.C., and the occupation of the offices of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And then from there, we're moving on to the siege of the Pine Ridge Reservation, in which Lakota Sioux actually are going to surround the Pine Ridge Reservation and demand the ouster of the Lakota tribal leader. They felt that he was a sellout to the United States government. The U.S. Marshals and the FBI are going to come in and shut the Pine Ridge siege down. 2 Native Americans will be killed during that conflict. Also, the longest walk was a walk from San Francisco to Washington, D.C. It took about 5 months, and the goal, of course, is to bring up and to get recognition for Native American goals. Asian Americans were also very active during this time in reestablishing Asian American identity, especially with regard to the Japanese. And the Japanese experienced some significant, serious hardships in the West Coast with the relocation program that had been put into effect by Franklin Roosevelt, where hundreds of thousands of Japanese Americans were rounded up and, in essence, put into concentration camps. So these are folks who are going to be trying to make claims to have their land restored and to be compensated for those lands, and they're going to fight a very long battle to get this recognized. In 1952, the Immigration and Nationality Act is actually going to reverse earlier acts of the 1920s that actually excluded Asian or Japanese from coming to the country, and also is going to open up the opportunity for Issei, first-generation Japanese citizens to vote and participate in politics. So we also see an Asian American Political Alliance, APA, and these are folks who are going to come up and say, hey, you know what, we Asian Americans have a tremendous number of nationalities, a tremendous number of identities, but we're all kind of in the same boat. So why don't we all work together when we see one of our own being oppressed? And this is especially going to become poignant during the Vietnam War, in which the Asian American Political Alliance is going to stand up, to defend the rights of their Vietnamese brothers that were being bombed during the Vietnam War. We also see a women's movement taking place during this time, and I think it's probably safe to say that the women's movement at this point is going to start with a book called The Feminine Mystique, written by Betty Friedan. And in this book, The Feminine Mystique, she's kind of pointing out that, you know what, I really don't think have things all that bad, but there's still something missing. We have this understanding that women are supposed to stay in the home and nurture their children and bake cookies and make meatloaf and take care of their husband and do the dusting and the cleaning, and yet this is supposed to satisfy us, but doesn't really seem to satisfy us. Maybe women actually want to do something more than that. Maybe we don't want to be, in essence, de facto domestic servants. Maybe we actually want to do things like have careers and explore the universe and things along those lines. So I ask myself why I'm so dissatisfied. I've got my health, fine children, a lovely home, enough money. My husband has a real future as an electronics engineer. It's as if ever since you were a little girl, there's always been somebody or something that will take care of your life. Your parents or college or falling in love or having a child or moving to a new house Then you wake up one morning and there's nothing to look forward to. Right? That maybe the aspirations of women can be a little bit higher than just taking care of the house. Not that there's anything wrong with taking care of the household. But anyway, this is going to inspire a new wave of feminism, what we'll call second wave feminism, around an organization called the National Organization of Women. These are folks who are going to be dedicated to complete equality. The complete incorporation of women into society on an equal level and equal footing with men. Holy cow, this is a pretty radical idea, right? Although we don't seem to think it is a particularly radical idea now, this is the bottom line with regard to feminism. So the National Organization of Women are going to pursue the Equal Rights Amendment. We've already talked about this. There were some folks out there who suggested that an Equal Rights Amendment would mean that women then would be subject to things like the draft and things that are not necessarily pleasant things. And then what are we going to do? We're going to actually have women in combat. And, that can't work. Well, anyway, so we're going to have out this Equal Rights Amendment. And we're literally going to challenge notions of what they refer to as patriarchy, the idea, not even necessarily the idea of male dominance, the understanding that society has been dominated by males for 5,000 years. It's been a pretty good run, but maybe we can establish a society that isn't necessarily... We don't want our 5,000 years in which society is dominated by women necessarily, but maybe it would be kind of nice if we had a society that wasn't being dominated. So an essential tenet of feminism is the idea that patriarchy equates to domination, and that domination isn't a good thing. That it is not good for women, but guess what? Domination is also not particularly good for men. Let's face it, throughout history, we talk about male dominance, but there's been a relatively small number of males who actually dominated. The rest of the men in society really didn't make out all that well, except for the fact that they were able to dominate the women in their lives, which of course meant that they were alienated to a certain extent from the women and significant people in their lives. Also destructive. So patriarchy isn't something that is just destructive for women. It is also something that is destructive for men, and it is destructive to any particular group that is being dominated by this system of patriarchy. So that's in essence the feminist criticism of patriarchy and domination in general. Oftentimes these feminist groups would get together. They would hold what were called consciousness-raising sessions in which women would get together, talk to each other about their experiences, and plan what their next steps were. Many times, some of the actions that women would take even tended to be a little bit more radical sometimes. For instance, during a Miss America pageant one year, they crowned a sheep as Miss America, or taking the restrictive undergarments that are the traditional garb of women and burning them, setting them on fire. Now, one of the criticisms that have come out of the women's movement, or at least maybe one of the offshoots that have come out of the women's movement, was attention to women of color. Betty Friedan was talking about a very white middle-class society that was the foundation of her critique. And for the most part, the women's movement at this time is going to be dominated by white middle-class women. Well, what about women of color? Women of color also have their idea of feminism, or womanism, as some of them decided to call it, and with their own exclusive needs. So another major influence on the women's movement at this point is a Supreme Court decision called Roe versus Wade that happened in 1973. In 1973, the Supreme Court ruled that states could not restrict a woman's right to have an abortion within the first 3 months of her pregnancy. They could not put into effect laws that restricted that. And also, after the first 3 months, there were certain limits that they could put on, but again, they had to allow this medical procedure to be done in consultation between the woman and the doctor, that the states could not intervene in this because it was a violation of the woman's privacy. Of course, this is still a hotly contentious issue today, with counter movements suggesting that, well, wait a minute, what you're doing is you are killing a living being, and that the rights of the fetus to live is more important than the rights of the woman to be able to control her own body. And this debate continues on. We also have connected, to all of these to these social movements, the gay rights movement, gay liberation movement, that is going to be kind of centered around a catalytic event called the Stonewall Riot. No, it was only one riot. I just said Stonewall Riots makes it. But anyway, now there's a backstory here. I mean, it wasn't just gay people stayed hidden, and then there was the Stonewall Riot, and bam, we got gay liberation. Well, it didn't quite work out that way. There were already existing organizations previous to the Stonewall incident. For instance, the Society for Individual Rights, that were trying to make headway and to gain rights for gays and lesbians. But the Stonewall Riot is going to be a galvanizing event. And what is going to end up happening during the Stonewall Riot is police in New York are going to basically be told to harass homosexuals, to kind of get them out of the communities and thing. And they will eventually conduct an illegal raid on the Stonewall Inn, which was a popular place for homosexuals to gather and to meet and to listen to music and what have you. So they went in there, and this is going to spark a riot that's going to last pretty much the whole night. And this riot will become a galvanizing event. It'll get the attention of people all over the country. We're going to have to debate this. We're going to have to talk about this. People who are gay all over the country are going to kind of rally around this idea of gay liberation. So eventually we're going to get a group called the Gay Liberation Front, and the goal of this Gay Liberation Front is, in essence, complete sexual autonomy for everybody in the world. Look, the state should not be able to mandate who you love and how you express that love. Then you should be free to do that on your own. The idea, of course, is one of the ideas, is to decriminalize, homosexual behavior. Many states during this time had laws against homosexuality. So if you were involved in a homosexual relationship, you could literally go to jail for that. And we were kind of thinking maybe we ought not do that. And ultimately destigmatizing. Look, we have two people who love each other. So why do we have to put a stigma on this? Or maybe they're two people who desire each other. I mean, these are sexual feelings. These are emotions that all people have. In this case, we have them for people who are of the same sex and same gender. This is not an unusual thing. Let's take the stigma away from homosexuality and develop something, this idea of gay pride, that being gay is who I am, and that is perfectly fine, and I don't owe anybody an explanation for this. Real powerful stuff. We also see during this time a movement called the Free Speech Movement, which is also going to be tied. I'm going to tie it in. You can argue with me if you want. I'm going to tie it into another movement called the counterculture. Now, probably one of the most forceful works on this comes from the Students for a Democratic Society. In a great work of literature called the Port Huron Statement. These were young people gathered in Port Huron, and they put together this statement. So one of the things from the statement: we regard men as infinitely precious and possessed of unfulfilled capacities of reason, freedom, and love. In affirming these principles, we are aware of countering perhaps the dominant conceptions of man in the 20th century, that he is a thing to be manipulated and that he is inherently incapable of directing his own affairs. We oppose the depersonalization that reduces human beings to the status of things. So we're looking at a consumer society. Now these were middle-class young people who go into college. They were pretty well off, and they flat out say, hey, we are pretty well off, but look at what we're facing. Look at the future that we're facing. It's a rather dehumanizing future, a future of inequality, and a future where, let's face it, we can all be vaporized at any given time. So maybe this isn't the best way to run society. Maybe we need to have new concepts of democracy out there. And these guys are going to become advocates and activists toward creating this new concept of a democratic society. We're also going to see the free speech movement rising in Berkeley, California, University of California, Berkeley, when when school officials are going to shut down information booths that were set up after the Freedom Summer campaign. And you have a whole bunch of activists and you're telling them to not be active. That's probably not going to work. So guess what? Now the activists are going to be active against you. Bad planning all around, and it doesn't really work out for these folks. These are young people, and interestingly enough, this particular movement included and involved both liberal political groups and conservative political groups, liberal social groups and conservative social groups, and everything in between. That said, wait a minute, you can't squelch people's right to free speech. We have a right to speak our mind and say what we will. So this free speech movement really starts to come into effect and challenge our understanding of what it means to speak out. It challenges what exactly is meant by obscenity. For instance, why can't we talk about sexuality and sexual issues? Things along those lines. So we're really going to start to test the limits of what constitutes free speech. We also have a counterculture. These are folks who are taking a look at the established norms of their society. Again, these are young people. Young people tend to do that. They tend to criticize the norms and values of their society, and they start to say, you know what? None of this is legitimate. All of the rules that are out there, all of these traditions are basically oppressive and dominating, standards, and we want to break free from that. We want to be able to experiment with our own rules, and we want to be able to follow our own rules and enjoy true, real freedom without being confined to the old traditional laws and rules. And of course, that means that these were folks who were doing some pretty interesting things, and trying to pursue their own way. They've oftentimes been rather, derogatorily, is that a word? I don't think that's a word. But anyway, they were referred to as hippies and that kind of thing. With men wearing their hair long and growing beards, and women, wearing loose clothing and things along those lines. Painting their faces and participating in alternate lifestyles, eschewing marriage, free love. There's all kinds of things that folks at this point were saying, hey, we should have the freedom to participate in these things. They don't do anybody any harm. And hey, it's a heck of a lot better than the bombs and the stuff that you guys have created in your society. We're going to create a society in which we make love, not war. Pretty. Drugs are also an essential feature to this particular movement. We can't ignore that fact, even though many of our our adult peers would like us to do that. We also see during this time challenging sexual norms and sexual mores. What we refer to, I think the very first sexual revolution is going to take place in the 1920s, but now in the late 1960s, we're going to see a whole different kind of sexual revolution where we're going to say, why is it inappropriate for women to pursue sexuality and sexual relations outside of the bonds of marriage, and pursuing these relations in their own way, in their own, in manners of their own desire and their own choosing? Isn't this what freedom is all about? So another aspect of this is the invention of the birth control pill, in which now women are going to be liberated from if you think about it, the fear of becoming pregnant as a result of sex, which is going to open up women to making other sexual decisions. And this is going to be very, very disturbing to folks who are kind of invested in the traditional ways of understanding boy-girl relationships. So this is going to be a period of, you have this group. Now this group, understand, when we think about the 60s, we think everybody was hippies and doing free love and dropping LSD. No. These folks were a minority of the population. They were not the majority of the population. Most people were not involved in this. But this was a very vocal and very visible minority. At one point they had pretty much taken over the Haight-Ashbury section of San Francisco. So they were out there and they were interesting. So they got TV cameras aimed at them quite often, and became the center of popular culture. And they are challenging our understanding of sexual values and mores and morals and norms. They're making us debate this, and we're going to kind of negotiate this minefield between, the total free love concept, or the traditional Victorian values. And honestly, within the last generation or 2 generations, most of us have actually kind of settled for something in between. But there wouldn't have been that had there not been this particular counterculture challenging those values along the step of the way. So, during the 1960s, we have a situation in which it sure did look like the times were a-changing, as Bob Dylan would say, and a lot of this had to do with the tremendous youthful energy that existed during this particular time. I know I've left stuff out. I left out the environmental movement, which is very, very important to me. I've left out a whole bunch of stuff, but go in the books. You can see there were a whole bunch of movements during this time that deserve their due. So, and I apologize if I left out your group, and I'm sorry if I left out anything that you think is important.